Alright, hopefully this goes well. Hopefully this is not a disaster. Hi everyone, my name is Ronnie, and today I will be talking about Tourette syndrome, which is a neurological condition that I have. This talk was actually given to a Emory University undergraduate class in a course titled Behavioral Neuroscience. So it will be a bit technical, it can get a little technical, but I will try to explain as much of it as possible. A lot of you have requested this recording, and I really appreciate that. So this one is for you who weren't able to attend the talk in person. Before we get started, you can always feel free to give me feedback. There is a Google form that I've linked to, and for those of you who do not have access to these slides, you can actually get out your phone camera and scan the QR code in the corner, and it should prompt you to open a browser window with the form, and then you can fill out anonymously or not any feedback that you would like to give. And I will have this QR code present through most of the slides in the corner as well. My name is Ronnie Lee, and this is a picture of me many years ago. I'm a graduate student in neuroscience at Emory, and my current project uses biostatistical and bioinformatic approaches to understand big data in psychiatry. I received my bachelor's in neuroscience from Brown, graduated it in 2015. I was born in China, moved to Long Island, New York, where I was raised since very young. I went to Providence, Rhode Island for college, and now I reside in Atlanta, Georgia. Here's some of my hobbies. I really love memes, as you can probably tell. I do a bunch of artistic stuff in addition to my scientific work, and that is my personal portfolio, which you are welcome to browse at any time. Here are some learning objectives before we get into the actual content. By the end of the presentation, you should be able to list some characteristics of Tourette's, which I will sometimes abbreviate TS. I'll just say Tourette for Tourette syndrome, and obsessive compulsive disorder, also abbreviated OCD. You should be able to identify some common behavioral symptoms and disorders associated with TS and OCD. You should understand the difficulties faced by children and even adults with these conditions. And finally, you should be able to identify some treatment options available to those with these conditions. Tourette syndrome is a neuropsychiatric and neurodevelopmental disorder that affects your brain and your nervous system. Essentially, it consists of repetitive movements and vocalizations called tics. Contrary to what many people believe, it's actually not a rare disease, and it's certainly not a cursing disease the way that many people portray it in the media. So the prevalence of Tourette's is about 1 in 100 in the U.S. So there are estimated 1 million people with this disorder, many of whom have not yet been diagnosed. We know that boys are 3 to 4 times more likely to have it than girls, suggesting there might be some genetic component. Even though there's no single Mendelian trait, there's no single Tourette gene, the disorder does follow a autosomal dominant pattern of transmission, which means that if you have one affected parent, the chances of having a child with Tourette's is around 1/2 at least. The symptoms of Tourette's start at around ages 5 to 7, although that can vary a little bit sometimes. Usually it starts in childhood though. It can get better and go away for some people by adulthood. For me, it got better recently, but it hasn't completely gone away. And because there's no specific Tourette gene, there's no genetic testing that you can do in utero, and of course there's no cure. Like I said before, the symptoms of Tourette syndrome are called tics. So it's not spelled with a K, just TICS. The symptoms, these tics vary tremendously in nature, frequency, and severity among individuals. Tics can be classified as vocal and motor, and simple and complex. I will be giving you a brief example and overview of some example tics. But again, they vary tremendously from person to person. One symptom of Tourette syndrome is called coprolalia, which comes from the Greek words meaning feces and speak. So coprolalia is the use of often inappropriate language, swear words, slurs, etc., that are socially obscene and socially inappropriate. These words are not used intentionally with any malicious intent, though. Similar to coprolalia, there is a phenomenon called copropraxia, which means to perform inappropriate actions, such as giving the finger to someone and touching other people in inappropriate places. So, contrary to what the media usually portrays, these copro phenomena, this coprolalia, copropraxia, are pretty rare. So they're only about 10% of the people who have Tourette's. So it's a pretty small percentage of the general population. Some examples of tics you can see in this table here. Simple tics usually involve, you probably have figured out by now, are pretty simple. Usually involve one or two muscles. So simple vocal tics can be humming, clearing your throat, or yelling a word or a phrase or making a sound. Complex vocal tics are when you have tics that might involve entire words, phrases, even sentences. You have phenomena like coprolalia, which we talked about. You have echolalia and palilalia. So echolalia is when you repeat what other people say, and palilalia is when you repeat what you say. And simple motor tics involve things like eye twitching or neck jerking, shoulder shrugs, and complex motor tics involve more muscle groups. So they'll involve things like facial grimacing, making different facial expressions, touching other people or touching things, and like we talked about before, copropraxia. So just a little bit about the symptoms. Technically, we use the DSM-5, so Diagnostic Statistical Manual, to diagnose Tourette syndrome. The DSM-5 lists these characteristics, so you have to have 2 or more motor tics, you have to have at least 1 vocal tic, and the criteria requires you to have tics for at least a year. They have to begin before you're 18. They can't be due to other things like other medications, drugs, or other conditions. And this is all well and good. My biggest problem with these criteria is that there is no biological basis for these. Unfortunately, a lot of, I would say almost all psychiatric disorders have these criteria for diagnosis, but these criteria are not based in any kind of biological meaning. And what I mean is that there's no chemical you can measure in the blood to say, well, if it's above this level, then you have Tourette's. It's not that simple. So these diagnostic criteria are often pretty arbitrary, at least in my opinion. So I really enjoy this diagram from the National Tourette Association, and it just shows that you have tics that primarily define Tourette's, but Tourette's is actually a lot more than just tics, and approximately 90% of people with Tourette's have other disorders and other disabilities, as you can see in this iceberg model below. I myself will be talking about obsessive compulsive behaviors, which is right here, but just know that many other people struggle with other conditions as well in addition to tics. And those are kind of all part of a Tourette family or an umbrella. Um, and so these other conditions in addition to the tics are typically called comorbidities. So I want to talk a little bit about OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. You might have seen it or heard about it in the media or in anything you've read. So obsessive compulsive disorder obviously consists of obsessions and compulsions. Obsessions are more about cognition and more about what you're thinking. And they are these repeated and unwanted thoughts or sensations. In people with OCD and not Tourette's, an example might be a fear of germs and a fear of contamination. Compulsions, on the other hand, have to do with action, and they are kind of the result of what happens when you have obsessions. They involve an urge to do something over and over again. For example, to use the example from above, if you really fear germs, you might want to wash your hands over and over again, and you might want to clean excessively, even though there's no real need to. There is something called the Goldilocks principle, which has this idea of just right. Unfortunately, I can't explain what just right actually means. I can't make you feel what it's like to feel just right. A lot of people with Tourette's just say that they have to do a tic until it feels right. And it's just a feeling that you get in your body. It's kind of like when you're scratching an itch. If you're scratching the wrong spot, it doesn't work, right? It doesn't feel right. But as soon as you scratch the right spot, you stop after a little bit because, well, it doesn't itch anymore. A very similar idea is illustrated here, where you have urges to perform a tic until you feel just right. For me, I have a tic where I hit my elbows on the table, and it can be pretty painful sometimes. And usually, when I hit my elbows on the table, I don't just do it once. I do it a couple of times until I hit it at an angle or with an intensity that matches what I want. And it's not super easy to explain. Okay, so my disorder can be summarized as Tourettic OCD, although that term is debated because Tourette's and OCD tend to be very similar. My vocal tics involve these ha or how sounds, and they involve high pitched noises. Some motor tics I have, including involve hitting desks or tables, jerking my neck, and back arching. These can be quite painful at times because you can imagine if I jerk my head back really fast, that can lead to issues with the spinal cord, even causing things like paralysis. If you God forbid, snap your spinal cord. I do have coprolalia and copropraxia. In terms of my more OCD components, I often wonder what the worst thing I could say or do is right now. And I often do the thing that is usually the furthest from my values. So, for example, there are a few racial slurs that I use because I know that they're very offensive and I know that they're bad. And that kind of ironically leads me to want to use them more. But it's not because I have that intention of insulting someone's race. It's just because I know that is a terrible thing to say. And then going back to the Goldilocks principle, I'm always looking for a kind of stimulation that will satisfy my body in just the right way. Finally, social anxiety is a big component with this pandemic going on. It's actually a bit made it a bit more convenient for me because without that many people outside, I can focus more on myself and managing my tics. When there are a lot of people outside, I kind of start panicking, and that exacerbates my tics even more. So this is going to get a little technical. I'm going to talk a little bit about the neuroscience behind TS OCD and what we know so far. TS and OCD are technically basal ganglia disorders. The basal ganglia is a collection of structures in the brain that are responsible for voluntary control of movement. I said will be covered later this semester because I forgot to delete that, but this is when I gave the talk in the Emory Neuroscience class. There there's evidence that the prefrontal cortex, which is in front of your brain, is involved in Tourette's, and this is because the prefrontal cortex is responsible for a lot of executive function, and people with Tourette's often have deficits in executive function and in inhibition. So they can't really inhibit what they're trying to say, what they don't want to say. GABA, which is gamma aminobutyric acid, is a very important component of Tourette's. It's thought to be the main neurotransmitter responsible for the disorder. GABA in the brain is a primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, and a lot of interneurons, especially in your striatum, will have GABA, so they will be GABAergic. Interneurons like somatostatin, formalbumin, MPY, and nitric oxide synthase interneurons, these are all GABAergic, inhibitory, and it's been shown that there is a deficit of these interneurons in the striatum of individuals with Tourette's. There have been clinical trials to supplement GABA, theorizing that if you give GABA to people who are lacking it or don't have enough of it, then maybe you can alleviate some of the effects or the symptoms. This has unfortunately not been successful simply because GABA and many GABA precursors and analogs do not cross the blood-brain barrier, and so they don't even get to the brain. Acetylcholine has been implicated in Tourette's in a lot of rodent studies where they found that selective ablation of cholinergic interneurons in the striatum often induces stereotypic behavior. It's also been found that anticholinergics can make tics worse, so a lot of people have trouble with things like Benadryl because it's an anticholinergic, and that for some people can make tics a lot worse. One limitation of the acetylcholine hypothesis is that I don't think mice really get Tourette's, because there's so much more to Tourette's than just tics, as I've mentioned before. So I don't think it's necessarily experimentally valid to suggest that these animal models, are perfectly representative of Tourette's. Just to continue on, dopamine is another very important neurotransmitter, and it's been shown to be involved in Tourette's because a lot of antipsychotics, so these dopamine blockers, are a treatment of choice. So things like haloperidol, Pimozide, a lot of other dopamine blockers like fluphenazine. These all block dopamine, and because they tend to work in some people, it's thought that Tourette's might at least partly originate from an excess of dopamine. Dopamine, as you probably know, is a major input to the basal ganglia, so it's very involved in your basal ganglia circuitry. In terms of serotonin, SSRIs can alleviate OCD symptoms and help with anxiety, although they haven't really been shown to be effective for tics per se. SSRIs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and for the non-neuroscience savvy folks, SSRIs are kind of drugs that you take very often for depression, and they just boost the level of serotonin in your system. So examples of SSRIs involve fluoxamine, which is Luvox, and fluoxetine, which is Prozac. Finally, there is evidence that the immune system is involved. So, in postmortem human brains of individuals with TS, they have shown that a lot of immune genes are upregulated. There is a confound, however, because we don't know what the directionality is. We don't know whether the Tourette's is causing the immune genes to be activated, or if the immune activation is leading to the death of certain cells and therefore contributing to the symptoms of Tourette's. So we don't know which direction that is, and it's hard to figure out because the brains that we often study are of people who have already died. Now, on to some personal challenges. I kind of listed a lot of things here. A lot of them are very crude estimates. Right now, certainly because my tics are doing relatively better, it's not as severe and I don't run into that many challenges right now. But this is kind of a snapshot of when my tics were really bad and even at their worst. At the worst, I would have about 6 to 10 ticks per minute, with each tick lasting about 2 seconds. And that amounts to over 3,500 hours, or that's over 4 years of just ticking. I've had Tourette's since I was 5. I had symptoms beginning at 5, and then I was formally diagnosed around 10 to 12. I've had about in the couple of decades that I've had Tourette's, I've had roughly 64 million ticks, assuming about 8 ticks per minute and 2 seconds per tick. I've been kicked out of over 25 Ubers and Lyfts. Drivers would simply not drive me because I was making noise. I've been rejected by a lot of medical schools despite good test scores and very good recommendations. I have also been rejected by a lot of graduate schools, although I did get accepted at Emory and I chose to attend. I've been rejected from every job that I've applied to, and I won't say that I'm always the most qualified candidate, but statistically it's kind of telling because I really don't think I could apply to so many jobs and be with decent credentials and be rejected by all of them. In fact, a lot of them, when I went to the interviews, they expressed concern about my tics. And even though they said that my tics would not play a factor in their decision, obviously they must have. At my worst, I had about 1 or 2 injuries per day. My arms have scars on them because I used to bang them on the table. I've spent 700 hours in treatment, just treatment, not at home or not including the hours that I have been trying to work on it myself. These are 700 hours working with a therapist or a licensed practitioner to manage my tics. And that 700 hours is cost over $25,000. And obviously, because of a lot of the coprolalia and the copropraxia have led to a lot of shame and guilt. Because again, those are not my intentions, and because they stray so far from my values, these tics have induced a lot of shame and a lot of guilt. I've listed, I think, all of the medications that I've tried, and I include this slide not to make you feel bad for me. Um, I wanted to illustrate the vast array of medications that people with Tourette's can take. This is roughly in chronological order, beginning with clonidine and ending with botulinum toxin or Botox. And I think one upside of taking all of these medications is that I can pronounce all of them now. And I can give you these are the generic names, and I can give you the brand name, I can give you their mechanism of action, I can tell you, um, what neurotransmitters they influence. So it's been cool for someone who likes neuroscience. In terms of other treatment options, the frontline approach is something called CBIT, which stands for Comprehensive Behavioral Intervention for Tics. Please note that CBIT is very different from CBT. So CBT stands for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, and even though that can be used to treat Tourette's, it doesn't target the tics. It targets more of your mood and your thoughts that are often associated with the tics. So CBIT, this frontline approach, is recommended as a first line of treatment for children. And it's based on this idea of habit reversal therapy, or HRT, and the essence of it involves competing responses. In other words, you are training yourself to engage in a competing response. Whenever you notice that you have an urge to tic, you will engage in the competing response, which makes it physically impossible for you to do the tic. An example would be sometimes I have urges to flail out my elbows, and that can be problematic, especially if I'm sitting next to someone on a bus or a plane, and next to a stranger. And so when I notice I have the urge to flail out my arms like this, I usually just sit on my hands. And when I sit on my hands, it makes it impossible physically for me to flail out my arms. And then there are all these medications, such as antipsychotics, SSRIs, benzos, Botox, adrenergics, and these are prescribed to mitigate the symptoms of Tourette's. And this is by no way a cure. And on the right, I've just listed some of the neurotransmitters that these medications primarily influence. So if all else fails, in cases with extreme and very severe Tourette's, in which there can be a life-threatening risk, there is something called deep brain stimulation, or DBS, which is a surgical procedure. This QR code that I've included is not the feedback form. It's actually a link to a YouTube video, so you can point a camera at that, and it'll bring up a YouTube video. The video is not graphic. It's just a person had this surgery done, and he has Parkinson's, and he turns on and off the remote. It's not graphic. So DBS is an invasive brain surgery. They drill 2 holes into your skull, and they implant electrodes in the deep parts of your brain. And these electrodes get hooked up to wires that run down and connect to a battery in your chest. And when you turn on the battery, it sends electrical impulses through the electrodes to that part of your brain. And the whole idea behind that is for the electrical impulses to override and to correct the faulty impulses that are causing the tics. So it's been really successful in people with Parkinson's, but less so in people with Tourette's, much less so. Again, this is just a video. You're welcome to watch it on your own time. I want to talk a little bit now about the downsides and risks of medications and all these therapies. CBIT, which is the whole computer response thing. CBIT works a lot better on children because their brains are more plastic. A lot of your neural circuitry tends to be more stabilized when you get older, and so there's less room for change. Although there is room for change, but there's less room for change. CBIT is often not covered by insurance, even though it's a frontline approach. I went to a CBIT therapist in New York one time when I graduated from college, and she charged $400 an hour, which was ridiculous. She was somewhat helpful, but again, by no means a cure. Medications can obviously have a lot of side effects as well. Major side effects include depression, suicidality, and kind of as a joke, the inability to eat grapefruit. Grapefruit contains an enzyme that will interact with a lot of antipsychotics, and so you are told to stay off of grapefruit when you are taking those medications. Because a lot of these medications block dopamine, essentially what can happen is you can switch from having too much dopamine, which might cause tics, and if you're using the medications to block dopamine, sometimes you overcorrect and you end up with less dopamine than you actually need. So in those cases, you develop the opposite, essentially the opposite kind of symptoms, which can be very similar to Parkinson's, where you have a lot of slowness and difficulty moving. You can also develop tardive dyskinesia with extended use of medications, and this is thought to be another effect that happens when you mess with dopamine too much. Finally, you can have something called neuroleptic malignant syndrome. This is a rare syndrome, but it can actually be fatal. So some people, although not very many at all, very few people have actually died because their medications induce this kind of syndrome, and it's unfortunate, but we don't have the tools right now to predict who is going to have that and who's going to not react. So I just put a meme here, basically showing the dopamine spectrum, where you take medicine for Tourette's and you get Parkinsonian symptoms. Finally, DBS. It's not approved to treat Tourette's by the FDA. It is approved by the FDA to treat treatment-resistant depression and Parkinson's. So because it's not approved to treat Tourette's, it's not covered by insurance, and it can cost anywhere up to $100,000 for the surgery. It's about $40,000 for the equipment and $60,000 for the surgeons and the staff. There's also a question of where to put the electrodes. For depression, it's pretty simple, area 25, under the anterior cingulate. For Parkinson's, it's usually your subthalamic nucleus. And people have tried in Tourette's both the globus pallidus internal and the central median nucleus of the thalamus. However, the major drawback is that we don't get good results with those locations. And there's no default location, there's no established location to put these electrodes when you're trying to treat Tourette's. It's still very much under experimentation, and it's still something that is being debated. Finally, deep brain stimulation is invasive. It's brain surgery, it's scary, and it's often done awake. So it's done awake because they will numb your skull and drill into your brain, but it's often done awake because they have to know if they hit the right spot or not. So often they will test you by adjusting the electrical impulses and seeing if that affects the way you behave, especially in terms of your tics. Finally, I don't want to end on doom and gloom. So I've actually learned a lot from having Tourette's, having this disorder. I've learned to stay optimistic, to stay hopeful, and to really to work hard for a lot of things that many people might take for granted, just because I have to put in extra effort to do those things. Through Tourette's, I've learned things about resilience, about compassion, having and advocating for those who have less of a voice. I learned the importance of education, of really educating your peers, your family, other students, like using this video here. I try to let my challenges motivate me, but I try not to let them define me. I know that that is easier to say than do. It's something I'm still working on, but that is the eventual goal, to have my challenges be my inspiration and my fuel and not my limitation. There are two quotes that I really like that I found randomly somewhere online, so I don't know the authors. But the first one is, if someone tells you you can't, they're showing you their limits and not yours. And the second quote is, remember the guy who gave up, neither does anyone else. One of my favorite poems of all time is Still I Rise by Maya Angelou. This is just one verse from it, but it's a longer poem, of course. And I love this poem so much that I used the title as my college application essay. So with that, everyone is on a struggle bus. So that's what the background picture is for. You're, again, always welcome to give me feedback using that QR code, or if you have access to the slides, using that link. You can always contact me as well by either visiting my website or emailing me at ronnie.lee@emory.edu. I'm always happy to chat, and I'm always happy to talk to you, whether it's giving advice or just providing support. And with that, as we are all struggling with our own challenges, and I admire each and every one of you for being so brave and dealing with all the challenges that you face yourselves. Unfortunately, we can't have 30-minute presentations of everyone detailing their specific challenges. So I very much encourage you to practice compassion and to practice tolerance and to give other people a chance when they are doing something weird or something that you might not understand. Thank you so much for listening to my talk. You're always welcome to send me questions, and I wish you all the best. Goodbye.